They are defined by Wikipedia as a type of harmful witch who has the ability to turn into, possess, or disguise themselves as animals. The following is a compilation of 66 skinwalker sightings I've recorded, all together in one 5-hour video for your viewing pleasure. Also, as a thank you for 300,000 subs, I've included a download link in the description so you can take this extra long feature on the prowl. Thank you, and enjoy. The Black Figure, submitted by Brit. My name is Brittany. I'm 13 years old and I'm your average teenager. Lately I've been seeing these black figures, and it all started way back in 2012. My dad worked at a dairy farm, and the farmers he worked for let him live on site in a trailer that wasn't too fancy. It really all began when his boss told him that one of his coworkers wanted to trade houses, basically a house swap. So of course my dad asked why, and his boss told him that the coworker said he has been seeing spirits, and it has been creeping him out, so his family wanted to move out. Eventually, my dad agreed, and they swapped houses. The first night I slept there, though, I felt like something was watching me, but I just assumed it was normal for me to feel alone and scared because in all the other houses I lived, I shared a room with my sister, and now we both had our own rooms, so I wasn't used to being alone like this. That's why it was easy to shrug it off, and eventually I went to sleep. A week later, everything felt normal and everything was just happy. But that was before I saw something. I saw this black figure just outside my bedroom window, and it scared the hell out of me. I ran out of my room and into my sister's, and she asked what the heck was going on. I said I saw something, but then I thought about it, and when she asked what it was, I told her it was just a scary bug. I didn't want to seem like a wimp or paranoid. 1 year later, we moved out to this new house right by the reservation at that time. I didn't know about skinwalkers and all that crazy stuff, and when I saw these black figures, I got scared, and I would just shrug it off like normal. I mean, I didn't know what they were, and so far I was the only one seeing them. A week later, my sister said she saw one of these black figures. It was right across the road, and it had red, glowing eyes. I was very creeped out, because I never once told her about the black figures I saw. But I've never heard of them having those red eyes before. 1 week after that, my sister and I stayed up all night hoping to scare the hell out of my dad when he came home. He worked night shift and he would get home around 5 in the morning. So my dad pulls in the driveway that night. The first thing we notice is that he's driving way faster than usual. We saw him literally run up to the door and we could hear the keys jingling around on the outside, like he was in a straight up panic or something. It sounded like something beat us to scaring him. He opened the door and my sister continued with the prank, jumping out at him and trying to surprise him. My dad literally screamed and almost punched her. I turned on the light at the right moment, because if I didn't, I'm sure my dad would have knocked her out. Then we asked him what was wrong. He said that when he was driving home, he saw this tall creature standing on all fours. He thought it was a coyote, but as he drove closer to it, he saw that it was far too large and tall to be one, and he drove out of there as fast as he possibly could. So then me and my sister got a little freaked out, and honestly I'm starting to think that all of these sightings are connected somehow. Maybe they're all the work of the skinwalkers. Skinwalker at my door, submitted by the Miraculous Fox. I've always had a sort of draw to the supernatural, and this story is about an encounter I had with a skinwalker. I live in southern New Jersey, very close to the Pine Barrens, home of the Jersey Devil. I'm sure you've heard of him. My backyard is pretty big. It has a large deck and a pretty big fenced-in yard. The fence backs up to a wooded area. There was always deer running around back there, owls, and even bats. On this particular night, I awoke out of a deep sleep to a tapping noise on my window. I had to have been about 8 years old at the time, and the constant presence of spirits in my room was enough for me to be too scared to investigate any sort of noise in the middle of the night. So I stayed put, just shivering under my covers, not quite sure what to do. I peeked through the blankets just enough to see what looked like a tall, thin figure standing at my window. You see, my room was in the middle of my house, and my window faced the wooded area just behind it. I waited a couple of minutes, and the tapping eventually stopped. Then, not a moment later, I heard a voice calling my name, a familiar voice. It was my mother's, but at the same time it wasn't. It sounded so scripted. I heard more tapping and the voice still calling, but the voice slowly drifted to the back door. The back door was in the kitchen, and it led out to the deck. I mustered the courage to get up, and I tiptoed to the edge of the kitchen doorway. I know I saw a figure at the back door window in the shape of a woman. It was tapping at the glass and calling my name in my mother's voice still.
"Kelly dear, please let me inside,"
that thing said to me. It sounded as if it was projecting the voice straight into my head. I was a smart kid though. I tiptoed to my mother's room and I quietly opened the door. And there she was in bed, softly snoring. I noped my way right back into bed, and I hid under my covers. Sure enough, the tapping at my window started again, but I did not dare look. Eventually, I fell asleep to the tapping, and when I woke up in the morning, I told my mom what had happened. She frowned at me and rubbed my head, sighing. "You have such an imagination," she smiled, and continued doing whatever she was doing. I went outside the next day in the morning, and there were footprints on the ground where my window was. I showed my mom, yet she was still skeptical, but she let me sleep in her bed that night, and we said a prayer together before we went to sleep. That was the only time that ever happened, and I hope I never have to see that thing again, the thing that I believe was a skinwalker. My experience with a skinwalker. Submitted by Anonymous. I've never been a person to think that skinwalkers are real. That is, until 1 week ago. Last week I went camping with my mom. We were at Strawberry, Arizona, if I remember correctly. We were going to be camping for the weekend, starting Friday night to Sunday afternoon. We arrived at about 6 o'clock and it was already dark. My mom started a small fire and we got working on putting up our tents. We were done about 30 minutes later. We had our dinner, some s'mores, and went to bed. I woke up at 10. I needed to go use the bathroom, so I got out a flashlight and went to pee. A few moments later, I began to walk back to my tent. I heard something scratching on what I assumed was wood. I stopped and I looked around, but there was nothing there. I jogged back to my tent and got in, and only a few moments later, that scratching came again, but it was closer now, way closer. After a minute or two, it went away, and I went to sleep a few minutes later. I was awoken to a loud screech. It sounded like it was within 20 feet of us. I didn't dare go out there with whatever that thing was. I was still half asleep, so I turned on my flashlight and I pointed it to the walls of the tent. Big mistake. It was attracted to the light and it walked towards it. I saw the silhouette of the thing come into view. It was a very large figure. Everything about it seemed human at first, and then I noticed the fingers on this thing. They looked to be claws. The height of it was larger than any person I've ever seen, and its legs weren't human either. There looked to be a fur about them, as if it was some sort of goat. It started scratching on my tent, creating holes in it. I saw a part of the tall figure. Its legs were, as I described before, goat-like. I did what anyone would do in this situation. I screamed. The thing scratched at my leg, and then the creature started to shrink. This is the best way I can describe it. And only a moment later it took on the form of a wolf, but still on its back legs, the thing took off. Immediately I got a first aid kit, and I wrapped my leg up. The damage wasn't too bad. The cut itself wasn't that deep, but it did bleed for a while. After that, I got out of my tent and went to my mom's. I told her that we needed to leave now. And within 15 minutes, everything was in the car, and we drove out of that place. It was probably 3 in the morning whenever this happened, and we made it home only a couple of hours later. Run. Submitted by Alex. This is an account of something that occurred 2 years ago now. Something that cannot be logically explained to this day. I live in northern Illinois in a nice neighborhood. There's good people and a pretty boring atmosphere. Normally, nothing weird ever happens around here, but this is a definite exception to say the least. Me and my friend, let's call her Anna, were hiking in the woods around the lake near my house. Now it's the middle of winter, mind you. The woods aren't that thick, and the lake is surrounded by city and condos. It's not remote or anything, and that fact is what makes what happened to us all the more terrifying. So Anna and I were exploring a section of the lake that's closed off from the rest, due to it being private property. It was the dead of winter, and as the sun set, we were armed only with our wits and some flashlights. We were searching for the presence of the small wolf pack or coyotes that had taken up residence here. Initially, we found nothing, but it was expected as wild animals tend to stay away from humans. It had just snowed, so if there were any tracks they would only be minutes old, and after about 10 minutes of scanning the snow, I came upon a set of canine tracks. The interesting thing about these tracks, though, was that they were absolutely massive, reaching the overall width of my splayed hand, but otherwise identical to a normal wolf. After seeing that, instead of hightailing it the hell out of there like any sane person, I decided to ignore the overwhelming feeling of dread, and I called Anna over to me. As we both looked in awe at the tracks, I remembered that I had my phone with me, and so I began taking pictures of the prints in comparison of my hand. I wanted to prove what we saw to my family once we got back home, if we survived. After taking an obsessive amount of photos, I suggested that we follow the direction of the tracks. Anna agreed, and so we followed them, going northwest across the property. This section of woods is used as a private dump by the landowner, and the tracks were leading directly to the small, flimsy trailer used as its on-site office. As we continued on, I began to get this feeling like we were being watched, but it was like nothing I've ever felt before. This was bone-chilling dread, like something was listening to my very heartbeat. I ignored the danger alarm sounding in the back of my mind, and I continued looking down at the tracks that had now begun to morph before my eyes. These prints were now getting even larger, and the toes began to elongate on both the front and hind feet. I froze, panic taking over for a moment, and I turned to Anna. I said to her, "Come over here, look at this. Are you seeing what I'm seeing right now?" Anna came over and looked at me with wide eyes before pulling out her phone to take more pictures. Despite the darkness, the cold, and now the danger of some creature lurking nearby, we trudged on with our investigation. Soon we were almost upon the trailer, about 300 feet away, when again the tracks morphed, this time becoming longer and becoming bipedal. The elongated canine feet were longer than my forearm and hand, not including its toes, making whatever the canine monstrosity was over 6 feet tall easily. Again, we took pictures, but this time more hastily, shaking the whole time and tears burning behind our eyes. Then Anna asked, "When are we going to leave?" Every fiber of my being told me to run in the opposite direction, and yet we stood there partially frozen in place. That's when the noises began. To our right, in the thicker part of the forest, branches began to break. I turned to Anna, and I said, "I think we should go now." With that, we began walking away, but it was short-lived. As soon as we started walking, whatever inhabits that lake, it knocked over a small tree, uprooting it completely. The sound terrified us and drove us to sprint towards the bent fence that leads out to my street. As we ran, there were solid footsteps behind us. Neither of us dared to look back, and we flew over the uneven ground, unleashing curses as we did so. Once we made it to the small hill where the fence lay bent, Anna scrambled up and leapt to the other side. I bounded up the hill, but ended up falling down over the fence onto the pavement of the street, getting up as fast as possible. "Alex, get up, run!" Anna screamed at me as she looked back at whatever was behind us. And with that, I shot back up to my feet, and we rocketed down the block. We busted through my door into the kitchen and sat down on my table, shaking and panting. My little brother came out to see what the commotion was, and my father soon followed, asking us what the hell just happened. I couldn't speak, so I just handed him my phone so he could look at the pictures we took. He was astonished and told us not to go back there again, especially at night. There are times where I still wonder, what if we didn't run? And that haunts me and Anna to this day. I still don't know what Anna saw behind us that night. I'm kind of afraid to ask.
The war had ended. The Umbra would just favored.
Baker Lake Skinwalker theme. Submitted by A. One time, me, my sister, my mom, and her boyfriend went camping around 4 hours from our house. We've gone camping well over 40 times before at least, so I have a bit of experience. Me and my mom's boyfriend, let's call him Chris, arrived before my mom and sister. Let's call my sister Leela. This wasn't much of a problem because everyone knew the area very well. So Chris and I did the usual. We gathered firewood and set up the equipment. I was pretty big for my age, and it took a lot for me to get cold. So people knew if I complained about it being cold, everyone else was already freezing. I'm an avid hunter, and I'm very protective of my friends and family. So around 10 o'clock at night, when I was just about to go to sleep, my mom, Leela, and my 3 dogs arrived at the campsite. My mom asked me to help unload some stuff, and once we did, not too long after, we went to sleep. Me and my dog Lucy woke up at the same time, somewhere around 3 in the morning. Believe me when I say it was freezing cold. But not a few seconds after waking up, I heard a distorted voice of my mom saying, "Come help me." I was extremely tired, and I didn't want to. I knew I'd get in trouble if I didn't, though. This was a big mistake. I put my shoes on, and I looked up to the cars, expecting to see my mom. And even though my vision was a bit blurry still, I saw something black and hairy hunched over on top of my car. I thought it was a bear, and in fear, I pulled out the knife in my sheath. I was about to start yelling at the thing to ward it off, when it started laughing at me. I froze. My dog began to growl, and the creature stood up, and it mimicked Lucy's growl. She whimpered. Then this creature jumped from the car to 7 feet in front of me and let out a shriek so loud that my head hurt. I could hear everyone else waking up in their tents. Chris came out seconds later with his loaded gun. This thing looked at him. Half asleep as well, Chris shot at the thing, and before I knew it, it had run off back into the woods. We ended up calling for help. This thing had scared the hell out of all of us. Even if it was just a bear, this thing was really close and threatened us, basically. When the Fish and Wildlife Services got there, they took whatever samples they could find. We never really got an answer. But being Native American, I've always heard stories, so the word skinwalker quickly came to mind on our way home. It stayed with me for a week. Submitted by Pyrocaster. Now, before I start this, I need to make this clear. I was 11 years old at the time. I was a very plain and uninteresting guy all around. I haven't had any other experiences with creatures or the paranormal since this. And another thing, this lasted an entire week. What I'm about to tell you guys lasted from Monday all the way to the next Sunday. This happened over 8 years ago. I was in 6th grade at the time, and it was about midway through the year. We were all stressed, since the dreaded midterms were upon us, and none of us were prepared. So all of our minds were completely addled from the random questions we were going to have to do. The day went by as uneventful as usual, save for teachers telling us to get ready and whatnot. School ended, and I decided that I was going to do anything that night to relax, thanks to the annoying teachers constantly pestering us about those tests. I went home and watched some TV. A few movies later, it was time to go to bed. And this is when it started. I was tucked into bed since I was a complete mama's boy, and tried to go to sleep after the door was shut. Soon after, I heard the TV downstairs turn on, telling me my mom had sat down to watch TV. I tried to go to bed, but something was off. No sooner had I heard the TV turn on, I stopped hearing it, and I stopped hearing any other sort of noise coming from downstairs. This could usually be chalked up to my mom just going to bed. However, she would always turn the lights off. I could tell she hadn't gone to bed because I could still see all the lights on from under my door. As I wondered why I could no longer hear her, or anything from downstairs for that matter, I started to feel like I couldn't breathe. Scared, I tried to get up and move, call for help, to do anything to get someone's attention. I found out I couldn't move or make any sound. Regardless of how hard I tried, my mouth would open, but nothing would come out. I strained to move, but it felt like my muscles had been paralyzed. They wouldn't respond to what I wanted them to do. As I lay there trying to get someone's attention, I saw it. There, by the closet door, was that thing. It was large, not muscular, it was actually very skinny, and I could almost see its bones. But its height was what grabbed my attention right off the bat. It was probably 6 or 7 feet tall, as it was clinging onto the door and was hunching slightly so as to not hit the ceiling. It had very pale skin. However, I could not make out any details on it exactly. Not that night anyways. The last thing I noticed about it was it had no face. It was just a blank slate, devoid of any features and devoid of any kind of hint as to why it was there. I looked at this thing, feeling what I imagine is a primal instinct that is found in anything that looks into something like this. It was fear. Not the kind of fear you get when you see your parents get into a fight. Not the kind of fear you have when looking at a wild predator, really. Now, this is what I would imagine. The kind of fear you feel when you know that your life is at the whim of something altogether completely, horribly wrong. This thing stayed there on the door for hours. It never moved, not so much as an inch. It just stayed there and did nothing, just like how I could do nothing. As the hours passed and as the fear settled in, I could think to some degree. I realized that I had no idea what I was going to do. Mom would come in at 6:30 to wake me up, and this thing was still there, not making a sound or movement. The time was drawing nearer to when she was supposed to come and wake me up, and I began to panic. I tried to move, but I was still in that paralyzed state. I tried to scream, and nothing would come out. However, I could still see under my door, and I noticed that a shadow was walking up the stairs and towards it. I still couldn't do anything. But as the door opened and I glanced over to it, I immediately looked back, and that thing on the closet was gone. It vanished without a trace. When it was gone, it felt like I had control over myself again, save for one thing, and that being a strange feeling that I shouldn't tell anyone what happened. So when my mom opened the door and saw me, asking why I looked so pale, all I could say was, it was just a bad dream. You know, the one about the werewolves in the kitchen. Seeming to understand, or at the very least thinking she did, she came over and told me it was alright, and that monsters weren't real. I really wish that was true. I even went to school like normal. I forgot about what happened the night before. School ended, I got home, and I went outside to walk around the neighborhood. I was back home before dinner. I went upstairs to go to bed, having completely forgotten, or maybe having wrote it off as a bad dream, and I tried to go to sleep. That night as well, however, it came again, and this time was almost the same as the night before. I lost all of my hearing, and then I could not speak, and finally I was unable to move a muscle, same as before. And then there was that thing again. This time it had changed position. Now it was further down the door, its knees bent backwards. It was crossing its arms, which I could tell from its new angle had claws on the end. This thing was now looking right at me, or at least it was pointed in my direction. And once again it stood silent and unmoving. This time I did not even try to do anything. I just looked at it and waited for it to do something. I waited, and thankfully it did not do anything again, leaving in a similar fashion as the night before. This time, when I left home and got to school, I did not forget about it. The day passed, and I still could not get this thing out of my head. I couldn't think of any reason why it would be there. I hadn't seen any horror movies in the last 3 months, and school wasn't stressing me out that bad. So what the reason was to this haunting, or quite possibly stalking, I don't know. I still don't have an answer to it to this day. This happened every night though, and the only things that changed each night were its position towards me, and how far away it was. The third night, it had left the door and positioned itself on the floor in between. It was squatting, looking like it was either trying to imitate a frog or prepare to launch itself into the air, towards me, with its claws extended. But it never did. On the fourth night, that primal fear almost went away. However, it got even closer, now peeking its head over the end of my bed, with its hand actually on it. It stayed like that all night. And the next day, I tried to see if it had left some kind of mark on the floor or on my bed. But there was nothing. Night 5 came, and it was now crouched on the end of my bed, being careful that it was not touching any part of the bed I occupied with my legs. Night 6, and it was no longer on my bed, but extremely close on the wall to my left, holding a position that looked like it was eyeing a toy or foreign object. Now, before I talk about the last night, as it is the hardest and most uncomfortable part for me to write about, let me say that I had tried to block it from getting closer each day before I went to bed. I would put coats in the closet, which made it leave the door. I tried to put a chair in between me and it from where it was like the night before, and it ended up pushed to the end of my bed. Needless to say, I stopped trying after that, thinking that I was inciting it to get closer each time, and I tried to do something else. That final night, it got close, and by close, I mean it had made sure its face was only a few inches from mine, so there was no way for me to see behind it. It used its arm and a leg on the wall to hold itself up, while the other arm was on the wall behind me, and the other leg was bent and holding up the right side of my bed. Not only did this thing position itself around me in a way that resembled a spider surrounding a fly in its web, there was also something else that was different. That night, I had control over myself. I could feel that I could move if I wanted to, or make a noise if I tried. I could even hear the TV downstairs still playing and my mom talking to my stepdad. However, even with this revelation, I made no attempt to do anything. As I looked at this thing up close, I could tell that it did actually have a face. However, the mouth, eyes, and what I think was a nose were all located behind its skin. That's also when I noticed that it was smiling with jagged and sharp teeth at me. I felt that it knew I could move. It almost seemed like it was daring me to try. I didn't take up this bet, and I just waited like I usually did. Now with the fresh wave of primal fear I had felt for the first 2 nights. It had no smell, and I half thought that this thing was made for the sole purpose of getting into a house and leaving no trace behind. As it continued to smile and make no movement or noise, I lost track of how many hours had gone by since I went to bed. At some point I realized that, once again, my mom was coming up the stairs to wake me up. But when I noticed this, it did too. Its smile got wider, and it was the only movement this thing had ever made so far. As the sound of footsteps got closer, I saw it disappear and then reappear right before my eyes, going from being point blank on top of me to being right on top of where the door my mom was opening. She opened it, and this time that thing did not leave. It made one final movement, a quick and yet slow motion of its clawed hand to its mouth. It looked like it was telling me, stay quiet, before it left from my sight. After it left, I didn't say a word about it for months, almost a year. I finally told my mother what had happened, and all she said to me was, "Don't worry, nothing in this house will ever hurt you." This should seem like a normal response for a mother to make, but I could have sworn that I saw her go a little pale after I told her. As a result, I wondered for the longest time. I wondered if she meant that there was nothing in the house that could hurt me or want to, or if she meant that even if there was something there, something she knew was there, that it still wouldn't hurt me, even though it very well could. After all of these years, I still don't know what that thing was. I've been told by some that it was just my mind going into overdrive because of stress, but even my mind could never create something as horrific as that. I've told others since then, and some say it was a demon that was just there to feed off of my fear. I have researched what it could be, and the closest things I've found that remotely resemble it would either be a skinwalker or maybe a wendigo. However, those still do not make sense, since those don't have their faces behind their skin. So, to this day, I still wonder what it was, and why it decided to stay around for so long and just do nothing. Was it a demon? Was it a creature from a horror story? Or just a figment of my imagination? One day I hope to find the answer to this, but I have a feeling it won't be for a long time. Call me crazy, but I don't feel like I've seen the last of this thing, and that it may eventually come seeking me out again. Only next time, it won't just stay there and wait for me to do something. Skinwalker in Big Bear. Submitted by Flame Daisy. My husband and I are avid campers. We live in Southern California and go out to the San Bernardino Mountains as often as possible with our 2 dogs. I am from Oregon and grew up in the woods. did search and rescue religiously, and spent much of my time going on trail rides and hikes as much as possible, just to give you an idea on how much experience I have. We've been married for 2 years, and have already been on over 20 camping trips, trying to visit as many different spots as possible, sometimes even switching campsites for a weekend, only spending one night. But this last trip scared the camper out of me, and it may be a while until I'm ready to return to the woods. We stopped by a favorite of ours called Holcomb Valley Campground. We set up camp, played with the dogs, and went for a small walk on the many back roads and some short trails, just revisiting our favorite areas. The dogs were behaving as normal, running around off-leash and playing. We were comfortable and calm, and came back to dinner and hot chocolate before it got too cold, and we slipped into the tent for the night. At the time, I was pregnant. I had to go to the bathroom often during the night, and I got up around 2 in the morning. I grabbed a flashlight and brought one of our dogs, a golden retriever, with me. Now, don't let the reputation of the golden retriever fool you about mine. He was raised without much contact with other people except for family, and with our other dog, a pit bull mutt. Moose, our golden, is very alert, doesn't like other people, and growls to warn them off, especially after we became pregnant. He is overprotective of me. Both our dogs are fit, and they're used to camping and going off leash. They don't leave our side. So Moose and I made our way to the bathrooms, and of course he came with me. He stuck by my side as usual. While I was doing my business, Moose's ears pricked up, and he growled his get-away growl. I was nervous. I didn't bring my knife like an idiot, and all I had was a flashlight. I figured it was just someone needing to use the restroom. I ordered Moose to stay by my side, and we left. But no one was there. Moose's hackles were up so high he looked huge, and he was pressed up against my leg so tightly it made me almost have to pee again. But we fast-walked all the way back to our tent and jumped in. I made sure my knife was there. My husband was fine, and our pit bull was okay too. Everything was great, and Moose even relaxed a bit, laying down right next to my head, and I eventually fell asleep. Now, here's where it gets really disturbing. I woke up about 45 minutes later to a low woof from Moose and our pit bull growling. They were listening intently to my side of the tent, both of them nearly shaking. I put a hand on them to calm them down, and that only made them jump and growl even more. My husband's such a heavy sleeper, I knew I couldn't wake him, so I got a knife ready, and I listened. I would say whatever it was about 40 to 50 feet away from us. It was stalking over the fence that divided the campsite from the road. It sounded deer-like, with light feet just barely crunching over the ground. I had been camping with herds of deer before, and it sounded very much like that, and our dogs had never seen a deer before, so I gave it to them that they might be scared. I lay back down and just quieted them, saying very clearly, "It's okay, guys, it's just a deer." But then, the deer outside said something, in almost my same voice. Just a deer. This voice said it like it was practicing something. Like how you rehearse a line you just can't get right in a speech. I gasped so hard my dog started barking like crazy. My husband jumped up and hollered at them for scaring him. I listened for the thing again, almost in tears. But the sound never came. The dogs were on edge for what seemed like hours until they finally calmed down, and it wasn't until then that I could finally fall asleep. When I woke up the next time, it was from a bad dream. I just remember running barefoot, and my feet were cold from being outside of the sleeping bag. It was nearly 5 in the morning, and the dogs were on edge again. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my knife and stood up listening to everything. I said clearly, "Are you there?" towards the direction of the fence, but nothing said anything. I think I repeated myself about 2 more times until a coyote howled. It was far away and clear, and I was starting to calm down, thinking I was silly for thinking that something like a skinwalker was out there, when the coyote howled again, this time much, much closer to us, like right across the road. And this one was not a coyote. It was a high-pitched yip that would end in a hoarse growl. It did it again and again, rehearsing the howl over and over. My husband woke up to this, asking me if it was a coyote. Petrified, I told him I didn't think so. This thing howled for over 10 minutes until it stopped and finally left. My dogs were just as scared as I was. That morning we went for another walk, then packed our things to move to the next campsite. Our moose ended up vomiting most of the day, and that made me panic. He was on edge, so he couldn't keep anything down, and our pit bull was listening to anything and everything, never leaving our sides for a moment. That night, we were at a completely different campsite on the other side. So luckily, nothing happened, and the dogs were able to get some sleep, but the next day, we stopped in Big Bear for lunch. Moose was all better at that time, and we all went for a walk in the village when we ran into our neighbors we recognized at Holcomb Valley Campground. We asked them about the coyote, and they suddenly went pale. They told us about what happened that night. We'll call the woman Mary and the man Ben. They had a small dog named Benji. So they said Benji had to go out in the middle of the night, so they unzipped the tent and let him do his business. He just ran to the fence and was barking until Ben went out and got him. Ben said that across the road, he saw a man standing there, and when he waved his hand, the man ran away into the woods. All night, Benji and the other dogs were barking like crazy until a few hunters went to investigate. They had their bows and a couple of knives, a few trained hunting dogs too. They crossed the road and went after the man to see if he needed help. They got about 20 feet into the woods when this man screamed at them with something between a coyote and something from a scary movie. It woke everyone up, and one guy claimed that the thing shifted before them into something like a deer with impossibly thin legs, and it bounded away faster than any animal he had ever seen. My husband doesn't believe in this kind of stuff. He shrugged it off as people being tired, and the night being so dark. But I know that it was a skinwalker, and that's more than enough to keep me away and to keep me up at night. So for people who love to camp up in Big Bear, be careful when you venture up into the hills. There's something up there. Whatever it was, it followed me. Submitted by Moto Bird. It was a summer just a few years ago. I slept in a bunk bed with my brothers in the room that we shared. I woke up one night from the top bunk. Like I said, it was summer, and it tends to get stuffy at night, so the window was open. I could hear a very slow, raspy breathing, and the sound of it screaming from the window being scratched. I quietly rolled over onto my stomach and looked over to the side of the bed down at the window. It looked like a man, but its features were just wrong. It was as pale as the moon and bone thin. It had long arms, and it had a hand with long fingers scratching at the screen of the window. Its eyes gave off a soft glow, and they sort of lit up the room a little bit. It was just looking around the room from behind the window. It wasn't even trying to get in. It was just examining the room. From what I could tell, it hadn't spotted me yet, and I couldn't get out of bed without it seeing me. So I just crawled to the other side of the bed, the side by the door, and I lay silently, terrified until morning. It left after about an hour, judging by the digital clock on top of the TV. The next morning, I went outside and studied the window. Whatever had been there had to have been at least 7 feet tall, because the window was about 5 feet off the ground and this thing was hunched over. A few weeks go by, and I go on a camping trip. My brothers were in Boy Scouts, and I was allowed to go on the camping trips with them, which I loved, because I've always loved the forest. It was in this enormous forest in the middle of nowhere. The property belongs to someone from Scouts, and there's nobody else for miles. Everything goes fine. It was a fun day of fishing and hiking and s'mores. Everyone's about to get in their tents for the night. Then everyone is silenced by an echoing, blood-curdling scream. It was definitely, absolutely not a fox, and there haven't been any mountain lions in the entire state for centuries, so it couldn't have been one of those either. Somehow, and I don't know how, everyone was able to get some sleep after that. I convinced myself to get into the big family tent, and soon, feeling safe and warm, I'm out cold. I woke up to the sound of the tent fabric being scratched at. I look around, and on one of the nylon walls, long scratches are being made periodically from the outside. I turn on the lantern hanging from the ceiling, and it stops. I can see its silhouette. It's the same thing from only weeks before. Large, tall, bone-thin with long arms and legs. It creeps away. It begins to do the same thing to the other tents around the campsite. I wait for it to finally leave, and I turn off the lantern, staring and in shock. I was somehow able to fall asleep. My dad's really into paranormal stuff, but I honestly don't know how he'd take all this. I haven't told it much, and every person who cared to listen just didn't take it seriously. I haven't seen it since, thank God, but whatever it was had followed me from my house in the suburbs to the forest out of town. I've always slept on the other side of the bed since then, away from my window. After doing some research, I think this mostly matches the creatures known as skinwalkers or maybe a wendigo.
The toys are nice too.
Thing in the Forest. Submitted by Cole.
Casket at the bottom of a lake. All you can remember.
Okay, so for privacy reasons, I will not be using my real name. In the story, my name is Cole. I was in middle school and 14 when this happened. In California, we tend to go out hunting, or if you can't, then you play hide and seek and other games like manhunt and stuff. My friends and I were playing hide and seek. Their names are Zach, Jordan, Amelia, and Joe. Zach was it. We all charged away from our houses and into the woods. Joe and I hid in trees and not far apart, maybe a few trees away. It was getting dark when we started, so it was probably 9:45. Also, the seeker had a flashlight. Joe and I were waiting to get caught, and were whispering to each other when out of nowhere, heavy crunching of leaves came from the left. There was no light, and we thought it might be Jordan, but we didn't call his name in case it was an animal. The crunching was about 20 feet away, then it stopped. I heard a very quiet scraping noise, then the scraping started again, even closer, like it had come 10 feet closer in 5 seconds without making any noise at all. Joe and I heard a tree branch snap and looked where it might have come from. This thing was in a tree in the middle between me and Joe. It was very long and had some hair on its arms and legs, and no hair anywhere else, and had sharp, stubby-like claws for climbing. It had ripped up the branch it was on. This thing was looking at me now. I was scared out of my mind. It made a roar or a hiss, and in a fraction of a second, it was on the second tree closer to me. I jumped down and screamed with all my might. "Get away! Joe, run!" The creature was now in the tree that I was in merely seconds before. Joe heard me and jumped out of his tree, and we ran so fast that we were in my house in a snap. We heard loud, ripping noises coming from the woods. We took my dad's flashlight that can light up a distance of 50 feet and shined it at the tree. The tree was torn apart. Then we heard insanely deafening steps. We shined it in the forest again, and it was making its way toward us. It was over 9 feet tall, with black eyes and huge hands. We flew inside, locked all the windows and doors, and called our parents and the police. Jordan, Amelia, and Zach ran inside when they heard us screaming. I don't know what I saw that cold day, and I'm glad I made it out alive at all. Something was at the door. Submitted by Nathaniel Olive. My name is Nathaniel, but most of my family members called me Nate or Nathan. And by the time these events had happened, I had fully moved out of my aunt's acreage and had been living in my creepy house for about 5 years. I had turned 11, and I had come to visit my aunt and uncle for a family get-together to say hi and hang out with my cousins. I will give a little background information about the house. It was built by my aunt and uncle before I was born, and it lay on a hill with part of the basement not inside of the ground because the hill is sloped. The part of the house that is not in the dirt faces the woods and has 3 windows on the left side of the living room and a large door that is on the left of the room that is right next to the last window toward the left of the living room. There is a large door that is on the left of the room that is right next to the last window to the left of the living room. There is also an inlet area to the very far right that has a counter or bar-looking area. This is buried under the hill, so it doesn't have any windows. The living room is connected to the stairs that are in the hallway, and the hallway has a balcony at the end of it. There are 2 spare rooms and the toy room on the right side. The toy room also leads into a room that connects to the outside through a little door and window. This room isn't usually locked, because the door that leads to the toy room is locked 100% of the time. This door that connects to the toy room is made of wood and has a pane of misted, translucent glass. We ate dinner, and my mom and aunt decided to get drunk, so we were going to have to stay the night. My brother and I had to sleep in the basement, and I was fine with it because I had stayed there many times before. My brother and I were forced to stay in the same room downstairs by the living room, which faced the woods directly across from the house. The windows facing the forest are split up, and there are 3 of them on the left side of the room. They are 5 feet by 3 feet windows and are very large. The room also has a door on the right side of the room, just next to the last window on the left. This door doesn't have a lock on it, it's just a doorknob. It's not like I haven't seen wolves, coyotes, bears, and mountain lions, and since I am an avid hunter, I'm quite sure the thing I saw that night was not any of them. During the night, around 3 in the morning, I had gotten up to get a drink, and while I was in the washroom, I heard a tapping sound from the living room, and then I heard my name called. The voice called in my mom's voice, and I found this weird because she usually calls me Nathan, but she was intoxicated, so I didn't feel too concerned. Thinking she was drunk and was sleeping on the downstairs living room couch, I peered around the corner of the hallway to look into the living room. This, however, was a mistake, because what I saw was a large figure standing about 5 feet from the window. The only features it had that I could see were its arms, that were very long and had a full set of creepy, spindly fingers. Its torso was very thick at the top, but turned into a V shape as it went down towards the waist. I could not see the head, because it was so tall the head was out of view. As I watched it, it began to move towards the door that leads into the living room, and with a long, thin arm it reached for the handle. Seeing this happen seriously disturbed me, and I knew I needed to scream, so that is what I did. I screamed so loud that I woke up everyone in the house, including my very drunk aunt and mother. Before I knew what was happening, the thing at the door bolted into the woods, and these woods are about 50 feet from the door. And it made that run in about 1.5 seconds flat. As I watched it running before it went into the woods, it went down onto all 4s and disappeared into the pitch-black darkness of the forest. About 10 seconds after this, my uncle came down the stairs with his loaded shotgun that he kept in the house. He saw me on the floor just outside the living room, almost pissing myself. He knew I had seen something and asked what it was. I told him, but he just shrugged it off because he thought I had seen a wolf or coyote outside the door. The worst part was, when I went up to the door and looked at the knob, I realized it hadn't been locked. I'm 18 now, and I have not stayed at this house until recently, about 2 months ago. This time I stayed the night because my uncle and I were going out the next day on a week-long camping trip to go hunting and fishing. I again had to stay in that basement in the guest room next to the living room. I didn't really feel unsafe that night until I was awakened by a noise in the toy room across from my room. A tapping noise, and then a voice that sounded like my uncle's, but strangely weird.
Nathaniel, come here and give me a hand.
By this time, I was seriously freaked out, and I looked outside my room into the toy room. Inside that room, I could see the door that connects to the next room, and through the glass, I could see the figure. The same figure I had seen so many years ago, standing there and tapping on the pane of the glass. I went up to the hallway connecting door and slammed it shut, and collapsed against it, beginning to cry. My aunt and uncle heard the door slam and ran downstairs to see me crying. They asked what happened, and they asked me a very creepy question. Did you see the thing? This thing that's been bothering us for years? I looked up at them, and I could see the fear in their eyes. I nodded, and they sat next to me and gave me a hug. The next morning, my uncle and I headed out, and we went on our trip. Before going, we looked in the room I saw the figure in that night, and on the other side of the pane of glass, there was a chip that wasn't there the day before. Apparently, after I had seen this thing 7 years earlier, it had begun to torment my cousins by tapping on their windows and calling in their mom and dad's voices, calling their names and asking to be let in. This thing, whatever it is, it still comes almost every month to ask my cousins to be let in using their parents' voices. I wish it was a bear. Submitted by Hunting Love. This story, though it might come across as cliché, is very, very true, as both I and those involved swear by it. I will also be changing the names of the people involved, including my own. Having said that, let's continue. So we've all heard the stories about the neighborhood Wendigo, Skinwalker, or Dogman, or whatever you want to call it. Boy in a house out in the country at night, you know the drill. That's why I was rather reprehensive towards the idea that my father, who was divorced by my mother a good 4 years ago, would be moving in with a girl named Janet. She lived just outside a small town called Winthrop in Washington State, which has a measly population of 420. Her home was situated on a hill, on a large and rather secluded property that featured access to a creek and train track by trail. She had a front yard that was damn near an acre, with a thin line of trees around the edge. The rest of it was a clearing that would allow her 2 dogs, Rusty and Ranger, to graze during the day. At night, though, the field would become so dark that I couldn't see past the midpoint in perfect conditions. On one end of the field was a small dirt road in which people like me and my father could access the property from the highway. On the opposite end, closer to the forest, was Janet's home. If one were to look over the field from Janet's porch, there was a fire pit to the right and a small garage to the left. My father had custody over me every other weekend, and lo and behold, I'd always be at Janet's home. Both Janet and my father smoked, and I'd sit with them during their nighttime cigarettes. With my back to the field and them sitting facing each other and parallel to the house, we'd just chat for sometimes hours on end. One night specifically, in the middle of the summer, we were chatting along until my father stopped abruptly. He was an avid believer in the Second Amendment, and I saw his hand drift to his side and onto his .40 Smith & Wesson. He looked over to the field, and both me and Janet turned with him. The dogs went mad, barking into the darkness, and then silence. When I say silence, I don't mean a lack of human voices, I mean a heavy silence fell over the forest. We could no longer hear the ambient sounds of animals out in the woods. The dogs stopped barking, and even the trees seemed to stop swaying in the breeze. I turned just to catch a small white blur at the right corner of my vision. I followed it, and all I saw was the gated entry of the trail swinging open in the breeze. Silence firmed its grip on the forest, that is, until a small rodent caused a twitch in the grass near the gate. I imagine the movement caused this, but what I saw seemed inexplainable. A white, humanoid figure that couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall with the glowing eyes of a predator sprinted and grabbed the rodent from the grass, rolling over it and eventually slowing to a stop. It took the rodent in hand, tearing it in half. When it made eye contact with us, I swear I heard what I thought sounded like Janet pissing herself. Her being the only one familiar with these woods, I took that as a sign that this was no common occurrence. We sat for what felt like hours, keeping eye contact with the monstrosity that sat before us. Without warning, it turned sharply and exited at full speed through the gate and into the woods. The rest of the night was quiet, though we all slept in the same room. We being Janet, my father, me, and my father's 40 cow. The next morning, my dad and I packed hastily so we could return me home. Soon after, my father found a new place to stay in the center of Tacoma. His fondness of the outdoors seemed to wane after that experience, and we are yet to return to Janet's home. The Bloody Skinwalker. Submitted by Daniel. This was the most horrifying experience of my life. I am a 14-year-old boy, and I'm obsessed with horror. I'm tall for my age, about 5'11", yet despite being bigger in size, you've got to know how terrified I was with this encounter. I was on a missionary trip to Mexico with my church. We would be there for about 10 days. We would preach all day and rest all night. Well, sometimes we would preach, and other times we would listen to the old natives that lived there. They would tell their stories of their god and other things. It was the 6th day when me and my good friend Eric were told of the creature called Ye Na Dalushi. I had been listening to ghost stories and demon encounters, but this one made me scared, like very, very scared. The native told us that saying its name will attract it. He warned us clearly to never say its name. So when we were done listening, he blessed us. A couple of hours later, Eric and I were talking about the day to our missionary leader. We said the name about 2 times, being the idiots we were. We soon forgot all about the warnings and snuck out that night, drinking energy drinks and coffee to keep us awake and energized. We were interested in going down a path the locals called Creep. It led us deep into the forest. I was enjoying it, but Eric was on the edge. We were walking, and I had caught the scent of a strange smell. It smelled like rotten milk, but much worse. I don't know how to describe it exactly. I even began to get a little bit paranoid that we were getting followed, and creepy enough, I was right. We soon started hearing heavy footsteps behind us. I stopped, and Eric did too, and whatever was making the footsteps stopped as well. We were scared to death. We decided it was best to go back, saying that maybe a wild animal wanted to have us for dinner. I began to walk back. I turned around to Eric and told him to hurry up, and I bumped into something. The smell was stronger than ever. It felt like I had bumped into a red-hot iron. I jumped back to see the tallest living animal I've ever seen in my life. This thing towered over me, and I swear to God it had some sort of reddish thing covering its dark brown fur. It's hard to explain its head and facial features. It was like a bear mixed with a human in the worst way. Its eyes were blunt yellow, and I feared for my life. I didn't have to scream. The creature did for me, and it sounded like a wolf's howl mixed with the static of a TV. I ran, and I grabbed Eric, who was paralyzed with fear, staring at the thing. We both ran faster than we ever had before, back into the direction we had come from, but we heard its heavy footsteps behind us. I could feel my adrenaline pumping, so I pushed my legs harder and harder, all the way back to camp. After a while, we finally reached it, but something told me that I had to look back. When I did, at the tree line, I saw a huge coyote. Not the same thing I had seen before. I walked backwards towards my tent, still looking at the thing, and I watched as it stood on 2 legs. Then I heard the disgusting sound of bones cracking, and one moment it was a coyote, and the next it looked like a jaguar, enormous in size. It leered at me, eyes yellow, then ran off into the forest. I didn't sleep that night. I was extremely scared but tired, and I was far too terrified, thinking that all that separated me from that creature was a thin wall and a tree line. Eric and I told no one. It was very quiet until the 10th day arrived, and we left, thank God, back to my hometown. And honestly, ever since then, I have my reservations about going back into any sort of woods, ever. Sure, it sounds unhealthy, but this experience really told me you never know what you'll see in the woods. The Sheep Man. Submitted by Gabriel O. At the time of these events, I was only about 14 years old. I had never been as far as a few miles away from my home, with the exception of staying at a friend's house. However, today I felt the need for adventure. It was around sunset when I ventured out into the flat marshlands of Alviso, my hometown. I was supposed to meet up with a few friends an hour earlier to gather a team to explore what some refer to as a ghost town. Keep in mind that up to that point in my life, I was never too superstitious and into paranormal things. They only seemed like things for TV screens. Anyway, my friends never showed up, so I was left to venture on by myself and my small dog Zero.